let's work through some applications of proportion. Now, I would recommend that you try the problem, hit pause, try the problem, then come back and see if your process matches or your answer matches. Okay, number one, is the number of hospitals in the U.S. proportional to the number of hospitals in Latvia? And explain your answer. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to basically compare the per capita, right? The hospitals per capita. So think about what a proportion means. So if we have a proportion and you cross multiply, right, numerator to denominator, if the two sides are equal, that means they are proportional. Okay, so let's do this. We're going to compare the U.S. to Latvia. And we're going to do hospitals per capita. So we're going to put hospitals in the top, people in the bottom. So for the U.S., our left fraction here, we have number of hospitals, 6,146, and the population is in millions for both of them, so that's great. So I can do 328.3. Then I compare the other side for Latvia. So here's Latvia. They have 61 hospitals and 1.914. Right, we can't compare just basic number of hospitals because we have to take into account the population. So now we do our cross multiplication. 61 times 328.3 and 6,146 times 1.48. Okay, so we end up with 11,768.9754 equals 20,026.3. Now, if you compare just 11,768 compared to 20,026, the answer here would be no, they are not proportional because those are not even close to being equal, right? So the answer is no. Moving on to number 2. If Mexico wanted to make their number of hospitals proportional to that of Colombia with respect to population, would they need to increase or decrease their number of hospitals? Okay, so now we are comparing Colombia to Mexico. Now the question is, if Mexico, so we're saying let's pretend we don't know the number of hospitals for Mexico. Let's say the hospitals and the people, let's say that hospitals for Mexico is an unknown. If they're proportional to Colombia. Okay, so Colombia has 10,635 hospitals for 50.34 million people. And we're trying to figure out how many hospitals should Mexico have if their population is 127.6 million. Now, pretty easy to see this answer based off that data right there, but let's do the math anyway. So if we cross multiply, we end up with 50.34x equals 1,357,026. To get x by itself, we're going to divide each side by 50.34, and that ends up with the hospitals of 26,957. This is how many Mexico should have if they're proportional to Colombia. Now, Mexico only has 4,707, so the answer is increase. Mexico would need to drastically increase their number of hospitals to be proportional to Colombia. Let's change to school districts. If the number of school districts in Kentucky were proportional to the number of school districts in Michigan, how many districts should we or would we expect to see in Kentucky? Okay, so again, we're pretending that we don't know about Kentucky. So let's get rid of their actual number and say we're trying to figure out how many districts they would have if they were like Michigan. So we are comparing Kentucky and Michigan. And we're looking at school districts compared to the population. So Kentucky, we're saying we're trying to figure out how many districts they would have. Over 4.4 million people. And for Michigan, they have 548 districts for 9.9 million. Now, when you have these where you have the data and you're playing kind of the what-if game, it's always important to kind of see what they're asking. How many school districts would we expect to see in Kentucky? So notice how the first thing I did was I went to my table And I like crossed out the known because it's kind of confusing to solve a proportion when you know all four pieces. All right, so we're going to go ahead and go into that, and we can now do our math. So let's cross multiply, and we get 9.9x equals 2,411.2. We divide both sides by 9.9, and x is 243.55. So to round to the nearest whole number, we would expect Kentucky to have 244 districts. So you can see the actual versus the expected. We would expect them to have 244. They actually have 173. So very different, very different. And the last one here, if the number of school districts in Indiana were proportional to the number of school districts in Illinois, how many districts would we expect to see in Indiana? How does that compare to the actual? Okay, so we're comparing Indiana to Illinois. Now, trying to figure out where does the unknown go? Well, what are we trying to find? How many school districts would we expect to see in Indiana? So instead of using the actual districts, that's where we're going to use the X for districts in Indiana. Compared to 6.6 million people, in Illinois has 859 districts compared to 12.9 million. We're ready to do the math, so we cross multiply. 12.9x equals 5,669.4. We divide both sides by 12.9 to isolate our variable. And x is 439.4883, goes on and on and on. So we're going to round to 439 districts. That is what Indiana would have if they were proportional to Illinois. So compare those. Indiana's actual school districts is 295. If Indiana was like Illinois, they would be 439. Vastly, vastly different, right? That's 144 more districts that we would need to create to be like Illinois, which is just a vast difference. So that is playing with some applications of proportions.